I'm glad that there is an absolute commitment to advancing the goal of European integration. We have very ambitious plans.
We are a very ambitious country. We are a very ambitious government. We have a special minister for European integration in our cabinet.
We are changing the face of our country to become member states on the end of the day of European Union.
EU member is our goal, is our vision.
We want to be part of Europe. We want to be economy and open society.
Who in their right mind would actually want to be a colony?
Zanimljiva za svet. Šta je Jugoslavija za nas koji u njoj živimo?
Za mene Jugoslavija je simbol nezavisnosti.
Ja Jugoslaviju shvatam kao nešto što svima može da pruži sve.
Jugoslaviju stvari vidim stvarno kroz jedan brzi razvoj, brzi tempo.
Samoupravna zajednica naroda i narodnosti.
A ja mislim da nije lako reći da je Jugoslavija.
I don't think my early childhood in Yugoslavia was bad at all. I always got a lot of presents, the family was close, and close friends were the extended family.
So it was a very close culture, and people really cared about each other in so many ways that you just don't see that here in the same way. It's people are isolated from each other. They work and they go home and they just watch television in the evening.
We liked to watch TV as well, and even had a camcorder, which I, being the cinematically gifted child that I was, always tried to get my hands on. What I really wanted was the camera he was holding. When Mom took over the camera so Dad could come, I changed my story. I was a clever child, clever like a fox, which was one of the characters of my favorite show. Good night, kids. Sometimes my parents would flip the channel to the Parliament, where there were more bedtime stories.
Ja hoću da kažem nešto jednom priču. I za nas i za njih. Moja je priča. Dobro. Uhvatili su dedu i unuka kako su naišao je neprijatelj i trebalo je da potraže put. Dobro, vi se smijete. Kraj će biti vrlo tužan za nas.
Pa dajmo da čujemo tužan kraj, molim vas, dajte konačno.
As I was getting a little old for those kinds of stories, I did what every Yugoslav did in the summer.
1 month free vacation with pay. Oh, when was the last time I had a month vacation?
Kad je to bilo?
We Yugoslavs had it every single year. But I never noticed. I was too young during the times of communist Yugoslavia. Now I know what you're thinking. Communism?
It's an international criminal conspiracy.
Well, for 2 decades prior to 1980, Yugoslavia was prospering with its annual GDP growth averaging 6.1%.
A decent standard of living, free medical care and education, guaranteed right to a job, affordable public transportation, housing, and utilities, literacy rate over 90%, life expectancy was 72 years. Most of the economy was in the public, not-for-profit sector.
Yugoslavia was a different case because it had established its own form of a socialist model of economic activity, which was a mixed economy with private capitalist enterprise, with state-run industry, and with worker cooperatives.
It was considered to be a success story of market socialism. It had higher rates of growth than most of the countries of Western Europe. It had an advanced welfare state. It was a multi-ethnic society which lived in harmony, and in many regards it was a model of development.
I guess you could say there really is something special about this land. So why have people spilled so much blood over this land? Who was to blame here?
Obično je kriv onaj koji je najmanje sumnjiv, to bar ja znam. Pročitao sam tolike romane u nastavcima.
Before I continue, where are we? Yugoslavia was located between Greece, Italy, and Romania, and it was populated by Serbs, Croats, Bosnian Muslims, Slovenes, Macedonians, all of which are Slavs, and Albanians, Hungarians, and others. Their country was the result of a long fight to unite the people, to show the world what they can achieve if they work together, regardless of what happened in the past. Throughout history, this idea has been a thorn in the eye of many empires and world powers.
The idea was that the southern Slavs would not remain weak, divided people falling out among themselves or falling prey to some imperialist outsider.
Serbs lost their freedom after the Ottoman Turks attacked them in 1389 on the Field of Blackbirds, which is called Kosovo.
With the Serbs, the loss of statehood that lasted several centuries, for instance, produced a strong anchorage in the myth of Kosovo.
Journalists come to Serbia and say, why are you Serbs so darn crazy that you celebrate a battle that you lost? You talk about the Battle of Kosovo, and you're always talking about a battle, how great it was, that you fought to the death, but you lost. Aren't you guys masochistic? Isn't there something wrong with you? And I said, ever heard of the Alamo? Remember the Alamo? Ever heard of Masada, in which the Jews defended to the death and then committed suicide rather than to be captured?
For standing up against the Turks, Serbs were persecuted and inventive torture devices were implemented.
We lived under terrible persecution. We were whipped. We were lynched, except the manner in which we were lynched was by impalement. We were impaled. Now, if you don't know what impalement means a sharpened stick is put up your anus, driven through your body, and exits through your back without going through your vital organs. There were experts, Turkish Ottoman experts, who did that. So you were impaled, like Christ was put on the cross, to suffer.
There was, however, a way to avoid all this. Convert to Islam. And many did. Many had no choice. This made a part of the Slavic population Muslim, while the rest was Christian Orthodox. On the other hand, the state religion of the Austrian Empire was Roman Catholic, with a large Croatian population greatly influenced by this. When the Austrians illegally took over Bosnia and its large Yugoslav population in 1908, the Yugoslav dream had never been more threatened. So, a group of Yugoslav nationalists, Young Bosnia, which included Serbs, Muslims, and Croats, decided that enough was enough. A young man, perhaps you've heard of him, Gavrilo Princip, shot and killed the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Afterwards, he was quoted as saying, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist, aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs. We must be free from Austria." Although the assassination of their Archduke did kind of make the Austrians mad, and heck, now they had a reason to attack the last Slavic stronghold, Serbia. This was, however, not the real reason for the attack. The Austrians and Germans had a plan to expand their empire to the east. War was the only way they'd achieve this. During the early period of World War I, a bunch of Yugoslav politicians fled the Habsburg Empire and formed the Yugoslav Committee in London to raise funds and realize the Yugoslav dream. Towards the end of the war, the committee met up in Corfu, Greece with the Serbian government and declared that Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes were, quote, the same by blood, by language, by the feelings of their unity, by the continuity and integrity of the territory in which they inhabit undividedly, and by the common vital interests of their national survival and manifold development of their moral and material life. It was what the Austrians and Ottomans had feared. The old world order was gone. Yugoslavs finally got a country of their own. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was sadly short-lived, because another war was brewing soon, the likes of which the world has never seen. In hopes of keeping Yugoslavia out of the war, Yugoslav Prince Paul signed the tripartite treaty with Nazi Germany in 1941, but the British didn't like this, so they encouraged a coup d'etat and mass rebellion against the pact. The British were happy, now Hitler wasn't, and In fact, he was so angry, he wanted to wipe Yugoslavia off the map. Yugoslavia was attacked from all sides.
Yugoslavia at that time was divided up into 12 pieces, and some of it went to fascist Hungary, some of it went to fascist Italy. Macedonia went to the Bulgarians and the Albanians, and Serbia was occupied by the Wehrmacht and ruled by the Germans. Croatia and Bosnia were united in a Croatian fascist state under the Ustaša regime.
This was called the Independent State of Croatia.
The idea, of course, in 1941 was that Croatia would be a condominium for German power in the Balkans.
The Croatian fascists were quick to start eradicating all non-Croatian elements in the state. You know what that meant? Serb hunting season started. Yes, Hitler's final solution was applied here as well, and hundreds of thousands of Serbs, but also Jews, Roma, and others, were killed, most of them at the fourth largest concentration camp in Europe, Jasenovac.
The total number of 600,000 were killed at Jasenovac. The Croatian fascist regime, the Ustaša regime, had one aspect that was very distinctly different, and that was that it was a clerical fascist regime. It integrated into its political dictatorship the Catholic clergy. They were at the top of the government, in the leading councils of government, and they were also in the military, and they were also in the concentration camps. They were at Jasenovac. Some of the actual camp directors were priests.
Croatian Inquisition, which took place in World War II, makes the Spanish Inquisition just look like child's play.
Pope Pius supported this fascist regime. The top leadership of the Vatican was fully cognizant of what was going on there.
On the other hand, royalists loyal to the crown, called Chetniks, decided to act.
The Chetniks were the resistance movement which, even though proclaimed itself the Royal Yugoslav Army in the fatherland, was composed almost exclusively of the Serbs. However, after the bloody German reprisals in Serbia in the fall of 1941, the Chetniks realized that continuing resistance at any cost, when the Germans were killing 100 Serbs for a single dead German, was self-defeating and suicidal.
This didn't matter to the West, though. They just wanted dead German bodies. So, all aid to the Chetniks was cut and shifted towards another group of fighters who managed to neutralize all other groups, the Yugoslav partisans. The communists, made up of members of all ethnicities, were led by a guy called Tito. In 1943, Tito declared the new Yugoslavia, which was finally liberated 2 years later. Tito, if nothing else, was brilliant at playing political games with big powers for his own interest, which is just what Yugoslavia needed to gain complete independence. It's important to say that Tito wasn't just a leader, he was a brand, recognized in the world. He was one of the founders of the non-aligned movement. And why were they so important?
They were able to play a middle ground for the great powers that allowed the great powers to potentially talk to each other and discuss certain issues that could not be talked about openly.
He hopes to perform the difficult feat of walking both sides of the street, east and west.
Tito's strong arm kept the country together. When he died on May 4th, 1980, many in Yugoslavia were crying. Maybe not so much for him as much as they were crying for Yugoslavia itself. His funeral was the largest funeral for a statesman in recorded history. Then things started to fall apart when Yugoslavia began to get into debt to international creditors shortly after Tito's death. In 1984, while the eyes of the world were pointed at Sarajevo, where the Winter Olympic Games were being held, the Reagan administration was specifically targeting the Yugoslav economy in a secret memo, National Security Decisions Directive 133, which stated that U.S. policy will be to promote the trend towards a market-oriented Yugoslav economy. And it was in line with previous decisions directives which advocated expanded efforts to promote a quiet revolution to overthrow communist governments and parties.
It triggers a whole series of other initiatives, most of which are not published. The decision directive simply states that what the United States would want to achieve is that Yugoslavia cease to be a market socialist economy and become a free market economy model on the West.
As the Soviet system was on its last legs in 1988, Washington wasted no time in sending advisors to Yugoslavia from a non-profit organization with a high-sounding name, the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED.
Good morning and welcome. It's good to have you all here to help celebrate the launching of a program with a vision and a noble purpose. The establishment of the National Endowment goes right to the heart of America's faith in democratic ideals and institutions.
However, Alan Weinstein, who planned the NED, told the Washington Post in 1991 that a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. This basically means that the NED was really a sort of CIA spin-off.
Instead of having just the CIA going around behind the scenes and trying to manipulate the process secretly by inserting money here and instructions there and so forth, they have now a sidekick, which is this National Endowment for Democracy, NED.
Thus, the NED started handing out generous bribes in every corner of Yugoslavia, financing opposition groups, buying up hungry young journalists with dreams of a new life, and financing trade union opposition, pro-IMF economists, and human rights NGOs. The National Endowment for Democracy also controls and pays for the Center for International Private Enterprise, which in turn funded the G17. Who were the G17? They were an NGO made up of 17 free market economists, with 3 of the leading members being Washington-based staff members of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, Dusan Vujovic, Željko Bogatic, and Branko Milanovic. G17 coordinator Professor Veselin Vukotic worked closely with the World Bank, and as the Minister of Privatization under Yugoslav Premier Ante Markovic, he was in charge of the World Bank bankruptcy program in Yugoslavia during 1989 and 1990, which led to the devastation of the Yugoslav economy. Other members of the G17 consult for the World Bank and attend World Bank organized meetings. In 2002, they formed a political party in Serbia, and since then, despite the fact that in every election they've gotten between 7 and 11% of the popular vote, G17 controlled the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Economy of Serbia. This is not simply a group of economists. It is a network. The IMF and World Bank use this network to impose their policies on Yugoslavia. And how do they do it? First, they force governments to do away with any social protections, subsidized food or rent, free transportation, free medical care, all those things you don't really need, out the window.
You cut back in public sector spending, you cut wages, you cut employment, you abolish worker management enterprises. In other words, you force your people to work harder for less.
Second, they use economic manipulation and new laws to force businesses, public and private, into bankruptcy.
The World Bank describes this mechanism as a trigger mechanism, and they use that term. They say we need to trigger the bankruptcy of Yugoslav industry.
Then, these businesses are taken over by a small clique of leveraged buyout speculators and other powerful foreign economic interests. They purchase the businesses at rock-bottom prices.
Creditors could simply take hold of these enterprises within a 45-day period, and either the enterprise had to close down or it was privatized.
This is called privatization through liquidation. World Bank data confirms that under Vukotic's direction from January 1989 to September 1990, more than 1,100 industrial firms were wiped out. The standard of living declined 18% between January and October 1990. This downturn raised unemployment to 20% and thus increased tensions between the republics.
Impoverished the population through these sweeping IMF reforms, which in turn contributed to heightening social and ethnic strife.
So you have dissatisfaction of everybody, and everybody's looking for a guilty party.
Čovjek kad nema ništa i kad nije osvešćen u egzistencijalnom smislu, on se hvata za one vrste ideja koje mogu da probude u njemu čoveka. A to su najčešće te nacionalne priče, te religijske priče, jer on osjeća se nekako bitnim kad ga neko osme, pa da, oni su krivi, a ne ja.
In desperation, Prime Minister Markovic visited Washington to meet with President George H. Bush. He said that rising tensions among nationalities would be a consequence of his austerity privatization plan. So he asked for $1 billion in aid and said that if aid didn't come, there would be trouble. And we all know the Americans didn't want any trouble.
In November of 1990, President George Bush went to the U.S. Congress and pressured them to pass the foreign appropriations law that called for the cutting off of all aid and credits to Yugoslavia. The law also demanded that if any republic in Yugoslavia wanted further U.S. aid, it would have to break away from Yugoslavia and declare its independence. Okay, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's not my speculation, it's not my analysis, it's a public law. It's a public law. It required the U.S. State Department approval of election procedures and results in every one of the republics. It required that the republics do not hold national elections, but hold elections only in their own republics, and that the aid would go to individually to those republics. And when the aid did go, it went to those groups which the U.S. defined as democratic groups, which meant small right-wing ultra-nationalist and even fascistic parties.
This fracturing of Yugoslavia was not the result of pre-existing internal divisions. Those internal divisions were heightened as a result of an outside intervention.
By 1991, the inflation was 200%, and the Yugoslav federal government was unable to pay the enormous interest on its foreign debt, or even to arrange the purchase of raw materials for its industry. Credit collapsed, and recriminations broke out on all sides. Cooperation between the republics and the Belgrade central government virtually ceased.
The republics were not getting any money from the federal government, they weren't transferring any tax revenues, so the whole federal fiscal structure had collapsed, and the republics were left to their own devices. And then came in, of course, a new form of nationalism.
As the Americans demanded, multi-party elections were held, and economic policy was at the center of the political debate, as nationalist and separatist coalitions ousted the communists in Croatia, Bosnia, and Slovenia. And with the republics at another's throats, both the economy and the nation itself embarked on a vicious downward spiral. Of course, the local political figures did their best to calm the people down.
Nemojte da mislite da nećete odvesti Bosnu i Hercegovinu u pakao, a muslimanski narod možda u nestanak.
The people needed a hero to save them, someone with their interest at heart. Instead, they got these guys. In 1991, elections were held in the Bosnian Republic of Yugoslavia. Alija Izetbegović, a former Nazi collaborator in World War II, was a candidate who had an Islamic vision for the mainly Christian Bosnia, as professed in this little book he wrote. There can be neither peace nor coexistence between the Islamic religion and non-Islamic social and political institutions. Alija lost the elections to the moderate Muslim leader Fikret Abdić. Losing the elections didn't stop our Alija, though. He made a deal with Fikret, where Alija would be president, but would quit after a year. So, faster than you can say Islamic declaration, Alija made sure his presidency was extended due to the crisis, as you can't have a power struggle in such tragic times. In fact, there was a moment when Alija could have prevented the war, when he signed the Lisbon Agreement in 1992, which would have made Bosnia a confederation of 3 regions. Alija didn't like this. He wanted all the power. Luckily for him, the Americans didn't like this peace idea either. So the American ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, stepped in.
So Mike Habib was in this meeting with Zimmerman and Izetbegović. Izetbegović had just come back from Lisbon, and Zimmerman says to him, well, you know, you could get a lot more from U.S. recognition if you just waited. And Mike Habib told me his jaw just hit the floor.
If you don't like it, why sign it? Alija took the American advice and withdrew his signature, fortified his power, and the Americans recognized it. Another guy who just loved his power was the one, the only, Slobodan Milosevic. Slobo, as the masses like to call him, knew how to use those masses to get what he wanted. With a little luck and help from his close friend Ivan, the president of Serbia, he got sent to Kosovo in 1987, where Serbs felt threatened by the Albanians. During a scuffle with the police, one Serb asked Slobo why the police was beating them. Slobo then rightfully proclaimed he became an overnight star as the protector of all Serbs. However, this incident with the police was fairly localized. This guy needed a bigger stage. So, because he was so thankful to his friend Ivan, he booted him from the presidency. He also got him killed a decade later. You'd think that after Slobo became the new president of Serbia, he'd calm down. But no, he still needed a bigger stage. And what luck, a big anniversary was coming up. As Serbs were marking the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, which is the crux of their historical culture, waving Serbian, Yugoslav, American, and well, Canadian flags, singing patriotic songs, Slobo took the stage in what the West described as a nationalist call to arms, inflamed the audience.
Jugoslavija je višenacionalna zajednica I ona može da opstane samo u uslovima potpune ravnopravnosti svih nacija koje u njoj žive. Kriza koja je pogodila Jugoslaviju dovela je do nacionalnih, ali I do socijalnih, kulturnih, verskih I mnogih drugih manje važnih podela. Njihovo otklanjanje olakšat će otklanjanje drugih podela I ublažiti posljedice koje su te druge podele izazvale.
All right, maybe it wasn't that inflammatory, but at least the opera singers afterwards were pretty cool. But if you think this guy had high ambitions, what about a guy being compared to Jesus Christ?
Danas je Krist triumfalno ušao u Jeruzalem, dočekan I pozdravljen od naroda kao Mesija. I glavni grad Hrvatske danas liči na Jeruzalem. Franjo Tuđman dolazi pred građane.
Holy f***, the savior of the Croatian people, Franjo Tuđman. No pressure, eh? Now, Franjo won the elections fair and square, but the people around him weren't really that good at hiding what was going to happen next. Even these guys aren't buying it. Franjo's government was quick to arm themselves illegally.
Nismo naoružavali HDZ-ovci.
Yeah, right. What about this? It seemed like war was the only option. Thankfully, there were many citizens who just said no.
Ići putem zavađanja naroda.
Yugoslavs stood a lot to lose if Yugoslavia broke up. For 50 years they grew up together, lived together, married each other, and at the center of all this was Bosnia, with a mixed population of Muslims, Serbs, and Croats, a sort of mini Yugoslavia in itself. Massive anti-war rallies were held in its capital, Sarajevo, which had the largest number of ethnically mixed marriages, with a message to the politicians: don't sacrifice peace for political ambition. But with little higher interest in keeping Yugoslavia together, the politicians decided to send a message of their own to the demonstrators. Slovenia and Croatia were the first who decided that peaceful negotiations weren't working out for them, so they unilaterally declared independence in 1991.
Odločil da postane samostojna I neodvisna država.
Bosnia followed in 1992. All of them were quickly recognized by the West.
When the White House announced that we would be recognizing Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia, we at the State Department had no idea what that decision would be before it was announced, which is a very peculiar state of affairs. I was a desk officer, the office director. Nobody at the working level had any idea what the White House would decide. So you can say that the decision was a political one. It was not based on a careful consideration of what recognition might entail.
It was, in essence, a dependable way of making conflict inevitable. The question was, would the people buy it? Of course, as history has shown, there was one surefire way to mobilize public opinion in favor of a conflict and bring them back to the World War II mentality where all Serbs became Chetniks and all Croats Ustaše. Hardcore propaganda.
Čujte srpski dobrovoljci, bandu četnici, stići će vas naša ruka i u Srbiji.
Moja specijalnost je ubijanje četnika.
Mi smo Srbi supermeni, ratujemo protiv sveta, zarad sveti mi smo spremni, makar trajao isto leta. Hrvatska se krvlju brani.
Slobodno recite da ste ustaše i jeste i došli u svoju domovinu.
Ustašama poručujem kao što im uvijek sam poručio, a to je malo i vulgarno, jebaću im i oca i majke.
Došlo vrijeme da se Srbi svete, sve džamije u oblake lete.
Sad koljemo kaškom za cipele i to zajeđalom. I onda se nikada autopsijom ne može ustanoviti čemu je žrtva podlegla, da li posljedicama klanja ili tetanus.
Jasenovac, igra Niška Stara, Jasenovac, igra Niška Stara. To je kuća Maksovi mesara, to je kuća Maksovi mesara.
Ja mislim da sve djevojke misle ko i ja, da ove fašiste četničke treba poklati i poubijati.
Vi ste slomili kičmu četničkog neprijatelja.
Srećan prolazak kroz minska polja uz pjesmu Učini bar jedan pogrešan korak.
A tamo je i razrušeni Vukovar. U kojem neprijatelj iskazuje i dalje genocidnost, masakrirajući vukovarske Srbe.
Hrvate.
Slika iz Vukovara sve govori i u potpunosti negiraju sve tvrdnje hrvatske zagrebačke propagande o ubijenim Hrvatima.
Slike iz Vukovara sve govore i u potpunosti negiraju sve tlapnje beogradske propagande o ubijenim Srbima.
Yep, they were all pretty much the same.
Ratovi su pripremljeni i prirode ratova pripremljena je mnogo ranije, pre nego što su sami ratovi počeli. Kada su već ratovi počeli, uloga medije je bila da dodatno homogenizuje, da dodatno brutalizuje, da donese nove motive ljudima da učestvuju u ratu i da budu što je moguće gori.
Pa eto, kad gledam televiziju, vidim šta se radi i želim da pomognem i vredi žrtvovati za ovu našu Srbiju. Za život.
There was no official military mobilization. It all worked on a voluntary basis.
Ti. Vi ste dobrovoljci.
One man, though, who could make a difference, realized where this madness was heading. His name was Josip Kir.
Moj suprug je 1991. godine bio načelnik policijske uprave Osječko-baranjske županije. Tada nije bilo vojske, hrvatske vojske. Dakle, sve probleme koji su početkom rata dolazili rješavala je policija.
As rebel Serbs had put up roadblocks to control passages towards Serb-populated areas, Josip Kir, who was a Croat, decided to resolve these issues in a peaceful manner.
Isključivo pregovorima on je i uspijevao ukloniti svaku barikadu. Moj suprug nije dijelio ljude po nacionalnosti, dijelio je ljude na dobre i loše. Očito mu je to bila i mana, jer tada je HDZ bio na vlasti i ekstremni dio HDZ-a se nije slagao sa njegovom mirovnom politikom.
Kir was quickly becoming an obstacle to the aspirations of the Croatian HDZ and had to be taken out.
Mog supruga je ubio HDZ-ovac, hrvatski državljanin, Antun Gudalj, ali on je samo izvršitelj.
Who ordered the assassination, however, remains unresolved.
I tada je jedan tisak na dan njegovog ubojstva objavio naslov Otišao Kir i Slavonski mir.
Yes, the war had started, best characterized by two words.
Ethnic cleansing.
Ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing.
Ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing.
Ethnic cleansing. The term, however, was nothing new in the Balkans, as it was first used in World War II to describe how the Croatian Ustaše were cleansing Croatia of unwelcome ethnic elements, such as Serbs and Jews. In the minds of the Serbs during the 1990s, this was very much engraved in their national memory. Franjo didn't care because he knew he had the support of just the right people. German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, in almost daily contact with Zagreb, gave his go-ahead for Croatian secession and actually pressured its Western allies to recognize Slovenia and Croatia.
Švaba, znao sam. Ko će na Srbine da udari nego Švaba? Kako on bre više ne dosadi, je?
The German Serbophobia, it was geopolitical in the sense of 1914 and 1941. And that continuity also reflected itself in the almost visceral preference for the Croats and the Slovenes, who after all had belonged to the German cultural and state structures for hundreds of years.
There was, however, one problem in this plan. The Serbs, who were now a constitutional people of Croatia. That pretty much meant that no decisions about Croatia could be made without the Serbs, while Serbs and Croats had an equal status. Now, Serbs were facing increasing discrimination by the Croatian government.
A lot of people were killed outright and threatened. People lost their jobs. It wasn't just Serbs, even, say, Croatians whose married partner was Serbian faced similar discrimination.
Franjo knew this all too well. So what did he do? He wrote a new constitution.
The Constitution says that Croatia is a country of Croats. That's automatic ethnic cleansing, constitutional.
By creating such a Croatian constitution, Franjo violated the Yugoslav constitution, which he considered invalid. But he still wanted to keep the internal Yugoslav borders. The Serbs had a different idea. What the Croatian Serbs wanted was to have control over the lands they populated, their own self-government, their schools, a right to preserve their language, culture, and national identity. The Croats really wanted the same, feeling threatened by what was now being described by Zagreb as the Serbo-Yugoslav giant. The Serbs thought, well, if the Croats can separate from Yugoslavia, why can't the Serbs separate from Croatia? After all, the same thing happened in America back during the Civil War. When Virginia seceded from the U.S., the northwestern part of the state seceded from Virginia to form West Virginia that was loyal to the Union.
And when I got there, when we inspected the lines, and these guys all told me these heroic stories of how they were just simple peasant Croats that had been, patriots. And the JNA was this formidable fighting force that they had overcome. And all the weapons that they had, they said that they'd had to capture from the JNA. Well, that might have worked on someone else. When I looked around and I did my int training, and I knew who made various Kalashnikovs, and every single one of the weapons carried by these guys, everything from machine guns to sniper rifles, was all made in East Germany.
Even though Croatia never officially admitted that Germany was arming them, they decided to thank the Germans with a song. In German, so only the Germans would understand.
If you follow that bouncing ball, just recently, just last summer, Croatia donated surplus, I forget how many, 4,000 or 5,000 Kalashnikovs to the Afghan National Army. Those aren't surplus. What they're doing is hiding essentially a murder weapon.
The Serbs had more than enough weapons, and they were too eager to crush the Croatian army.
A što se ove njihove armije tiče, znate, to 20-30 četnika rešava sve.
The Croatian town of Vukovar was under siege for 87 days, which later brought a Pyrrhic victory to the Serb forces. Why Pyrrhic? Well, because they actually destroyed the entire city.
Vukovar se pročuo u cijelom svijetu po žrtvi koju je tom prigodom doživio. Naime, poginulo preko 4.000 stanovnika Vukovara.
A horrific example of how territory suddenly became more important than the people living on it. Even though they were brainwashed into thinking they were doing the right thing, some people woke up and realized what was really going on. Milan Levar, a Croat who was determined to protect his town of Gospić from the Serbs, was among the first to join the newly established Croat army, but quickly became disillusioned after an order he received.
Milan Levar je bio hrvatski branitelj koji je 1991. godine dobio neke zadatke da likvidira neke srpske civile, što je smatrao nečasnim i nemoralnim i odbio je to izvršiti.
1992. u 6. mjesecu on se skinuo iz vojske zato što nije htio izvršavati izravne naredbe nadređenih ovdje u Gospiću koji su tada vladali
I nakon toga je obavještavao nadležne institucije o zločinima koji su se događali u Gospiću. Kada nadležne institucije nisu ništa poduzimale, počeo izlaziti u javnost već od 1993. govoreći o nepravdama koje su počinjene prema njegovim sugrađanima, gospićkim Srbima, ali i nekim Hrvatima koji se ili nisu slagali sa takvom politikom etničkog čišćenja koja se provodila u Gospiću ili su na bilo koji drugi način smetali ljudima koji su tada vladali Gospićem.
His fight brought him all the way to the International Criminal Court where he testified. After that, however, extreme elements in Croatia decided to silence Milan Levar.
Podmetnutom bombom je ubijen u svom dvorištu. 2000. godine kad je bilo praktički puni mir.
Milan Levar je bio simbol Hrvata koji se s time nije mirio, simbol Hrvata koji je htio pravednu Hrvatsku. Zbog toga je on ubijen. Vlast je procesuirala djelomično taj zločin, otkrila je za 50 ubijenih osoba tijela, kaznila je trojicu odgovornih sa po 15, 12 i 10 godina i tu se zaustavila.
Instead of building peaceful and trusting relationships between the warring sides in Croatia, in 1992, the Pentagon was too busy proclaiming its imperial hegemony over the world in its defense planning guide. According to the New York Times of 1992, this document asserts that the only possible course for the U.S. to pursue is complete world domination, and it adds that no other country has the right to aspire to the role of leadership, even as a regional power.
It's simply looked upon itself now as the supreme power in a unipolar world, and that they could do whatever they wanted to do.
Yugoslavia had to be broken down, and there was no better symbol for Yugoslavia than its Central Republic of Bosnia. War erupted into the worst bloodbath in Europe since World War II.
Civil war. Civil war is the worst kind of war. It involves brother versus brother, family member versus family member, and it is one of the ugliest kind of conflicts.
The Serbs wanted to have control over the lands mainly inhabited by Serbs, including lands that were of a strategic importance to them. The Croats wanted the same for themselves, while the Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks as they're called today, wanted it all. To achieve this, the Bosnian government, now increasingly representing the Bosniak voice, started getting help from the Americans.
The secret flights started arriving at Tuzla. The Americans started to approve the delivery of arms to the Bosnian Muslims.
American President Clinton later admitted in a book that the Americans didn't enforce the arms embargo. Heck, but that's not all. Alia was also offered the help of hundreds of mujahideen. Come on, who can say no to these guys? Serbs, on the other hand, relied heavily on aid from Belgrade. As the Yugoslav army was the fourth largest in Europe, the West moved to stop Belgrade from helping the Serbs in Bosnia. So, in May of 1992, sanctions were imposed on what was left of Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro. By October 1993, 90% of Yugoslavia's domestic drug production stopped. The average daily intake of calories had fallen by 28% compared to 1990, and 1.5 million people were classified as undernourished. 2 months later, over 60% of Yugoslavia's workforce was unemployed, and the average monthly income had dropped from $500 to $15. The markets and stores were close to empty.
Nema mesa, nema lekova, nema ulja, nema beli sijalica, evo molim svi.
As usual, sanctions and merely hurt the people at the lowest rung on the ladder. People at the top benefit from them. They forced the Serbs into what was would happen anywhere. It was a criminal economy. The criminals became the king because we made it so.
If you go to Belgrade, what used to be the diplomatic areas are now all the thugs and goons that made tons of money from the war on the black market. War profiteers, big time.
Slobo's government hijacked the country's financial system, while Serbia's citizens were duped by several pyramid schemes, most notably by those of Dafina Milanović and Jezda Vasiljević.
Ja uporno ponavljam da smo mi izuzetno pametan narod. Ja sam donela odluku da svi oni koji žive od Dafimen banke i dalje žive.
Narode, želite li bolji život? Želite li posao? Želite li penzije na vreme? Želite li vašu staru deviznu štednju? Ja to umem I mogu da ostvarim.
For themselves, of course, because both Dafina and Jezda got the hell out of the country with the people's money. The economic tragedy, triggered by the sanctions, was reaching its peak.
The effect was quite severe, especially in 1993. Actually, the inflation rate in Yugoslavia was the highest in recorded history. So, as I recall, I think it was something like 1.8 billion% inflation rate.
They even printed a 500 billion dinar note. The lawlessness was intensifying and the mafia was taking control. In spite of the catastrophe around them, the Serbs would not yield to the will of the West. So one man decided to use this opportunity to save an organization that no longer had a purpose. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was a system of collective defense whereby its member states agreed to mutual defense in response to an attack by any external party founded in 1949. The purpose, really, became to protect the West from the Soviets, a counterbalance to the later formed Warsaw Pact.
President Eisenhower saw NATO as a defensive alliance that eventually the Europeans would take over. Instead, the U.S. has turned it into an instrument of power and eastward expansion.
But then the Soviet Union went bust.
The U.S. explicitly broke the agreement that was made with Gorbachev about not surrounding Russia with hostile, militarily armed states.
The colonization of Serbia is the bottom or second step on the staircase to Russia. We must be colonized because NATO learned Hitler's lesson. Don't have a two-front war when you're attacking the Russians. You have to neutralize Yugoslavia the way Hitler did.
But to do that, you'd need to create a case where you had to intervene against an enemy in Yugoslavia. Enter Joe Biden.
We face a blatant act of Serbian expansionism and aggression. This is no more a civil war than Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia had civil wars in the 1930s. This, as then in my view, is fascist thuggery on the march.
He was calling Serbs horrific names at the same time that he had a very influential position on the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate.
Biden was also emphasizing the importance of a new role for NATO, as seen in February of 1994 at the Senate hearing on the future of NATO.
Last month, while the Allies reassured themselves in Brussels that NATO remains at the bedrock of European security, crimes of a kind that were tried in Nuremberg a half a century ago continued unabated in Bosnia. Without a common enemy to unite us, we may find that our conceptions of what constitutes national interest may very well divide us.
He found the common enemy in the Serbian people, who were already previously demonized by U.S. public relation firms such as Reuter and Finn, hired by various separatist groups from Yugoslavia.
They not only demonized the Serbian leadership, they demonized the Serbian people.
The problem for the Serbs was that they were a little slow off the mark. They did not understand what was being done to them, and by the time they did, the whole Balkan region had collapsed into a state of conflict in which the Serbs were made out clearly from propaganda at the time to be the enemy of everybody else.
Thus, the U.S. quickly set out to act against the Serbs, stirring up a storm in Croatia. Operation Storm, that is.
So they came up with a plan where the Croatian army would launch an attack down into the Krajina and occupy the area that was manned by the Serbian minority. that had been there for, I don't know, 4 or 5 centuries. But it was declared that they were much too radical to permit to continue within the borders of Croatia.
And at a meeting on the Briuni Islands, Franjo gave his go-ahead to General Ante Gotovina for the largest single act of ethnic cleansing during the Yugoslav wars.
Da nanesemo takve udarce da Srbi praktično nestanu. Jer tu je važno, slušajte, da i ti civili, znate, da pođu, pa će onda i vojske, tako da kad pođu kolone, to djeluje psihološki jedni na druge. Znači, na taj način im dati put, a jamčiti tobože građanska prava i tako da.
An operation that lasted 84 hours in August of 1995 resulted in the death of around 2,000 and 250,000 ethnically cleansed Serbs. Slobo and his generals, the protectors of all Serbs, had abandoned them.
Šta da radimo? Pasavajte se kako znate! Gospodine generale!
Operation Storm, which was an American-inspired by some of my colleagues, because the people that were advising the Croatian army were retired American general officers, and who operate just outside the Beltway in Washington.
Franjo was very happy.
Nisu imali vremena da pokupili svoje prljave pare devize niti gaće.
With the Serbs gone from Croatia, the Americans moved on to Bosnia. Simply pushing out the Serbs from there was not so easy, so a different strategy was implemented. Presenting the conflict in Bosnia as a civil war, which it was, instead of a war of Serbian aggression, meant that the Western public would be confused and the water would be muddied. To intervene, the Americans needed to make it clear who they had to intervene against.
The Serbs started this war. The Serbs are the original cause of the war.
They are the complete aggressors and wrongdoers.
NATO was used to militarily continue the colonization process, but Clinton knew it had to be somehow justified to the wider public. Perhaps the best example of what we're talking about here is Srebrenica. Srebrenica, a village in Bosnia, was declared a UN safe zone for Bosniaks seeking refuge, but was never really demilitarized, which allowed Bosniak forces to attack neighboring Serb villages. Serb commander Ratko Mladic overran Srebrenica, with thousands of Muslims killed and ethnically cleansed.
What happened in Srebrenica was a stage-managed fall of the enclave to the Serbian forces, which never expected to conquer it.
The United Nations declared that this was genocide, even though UN observer Philip Corwin estimated that the number of killed Muslims in Srebrenica was no larger than the number of Serbs killed in villages around Srebrenica. But that didn't matter. Srebrenica was to be used for a much greater agenda.
There are trustworthy witnesses on the Muslim side who claim that Ali Izetbegovic told them that Bill Clinton had indicated to him, Izetbegovic, that 5,000 dead Muslims would be the price of NATO intervention on the Bosnian Muslim side. They believe that Srebrenica was deliberately sacrificed by Izetbegovic in order to provide this burnt offering to the White House that would be the justification for intervention, and indeed the proof of the pudding is indeed.
The Bosnia government had no choice.
Mr. Salajic, speaking for his government, said,
"We have no choice, and our presidency had no choice but to appeal for a military intervention in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
You cannot go this alone. The American public will not tolerate it. The alliance cannot stand it."
And intervention ensued. Here was NATO, an organization formed for the sole purpose of defense of its member states, attacking a country that has not attacked or threatened any of its member states. Louis Mackenzie, who was the Major General of the UN Army in charge of Sector Sarajevo, tried to warn the Americans of what they were embarking upon.
So I appeared in front of Congress and they asked me my opinion, and I said, start training your grandchildren to be peacekeepers in Bosnia, because you're going to be there for generations. And a lot of them are still there.
As heavily armed US and NATO troops enforced the peace in Bosnia, the press and politicians alike portrayed Western intervention in the former Yugoslavia as a noble, if agonizingly belated response to an outbreak of ethnic massacres and human rights violations.
A lot of the so-called liberal or left-wing or progressive media were themselves co-opted by the mainstream viewpoint regarding the Balkans. In other words, they had bought into this paradigm that was presented to them by the arms of the government of the United States and the EU powers.
Only the journalists who towed the line and found new ways to attack the Serbs, other than the ones that their editors sent them to tell, other than the stories that were pre-written before they came to the Balkans, those guys excelled.
Of course, the bombing campaign forced the Bosnian Serbs to surrender. At the peace accord signing, which internally divided Bosnia into a Serb entity and a Muslim Croat entity, all those responsible for intensifying the war were praising peace. This is the village of Vrbarje, near Sokolac in Bosnia, inhabited mainly by Serbs and Muslims. After the imposed Dayton peace accords, the villagers were aware of what this meant to them. And as the town became part of the Serb entity, the Muslims decided to collectively leave to their own entity.
Eto vas uplakani oba komšije. Ja. Danas se rastajete.
Da, kao tako.
Pa je li vam teško?
Kako vidite.
Je li ovo baš lijepo da se komšije rastaju u suzama?
Ovo je sa svega srca, mog i njegovog, sigurno.
Živjeli ste toliko godina.
Koliko imamo godina, toliko smo živjeli. Živjeli smo.
Bez svađe, bez nesuglasica.
Ne bez svađe, ne bez suglasica, nego sa pomoći jedan drugom. Čitavog života do sada je bilo i evo sada je tako.
Kako je sad? Kako vam je sad?
Teško.
Recite po srcu i duši, je li bilo maltretiranja, je li vam bilo ovdje loše?
Nikad. Nije nam moglo bolje biti.
Je li vam žao?
Pa još nam žao rastaviti se s našim komšijama, oni su nama uvijek valjali, dobri smo bili, slagali se, sve.
Jesu vas provocirala djeca, jel ste imali nikakvih problema ovdje, srpska djeca?
Nije ništa, sve smo bili fino, koji ranije što smo bili.
This video footage has never been shown anywhere before. It just didn't fit the image that the Western media had tried so hard to project. The tidy melodrama of the evil Serbs destroying everything non-Serb in sight. Do you think this would mobilize Western public opinion to intervene?
Nije bilo svađa, nije bilo pritisaka, nije bilo tuča, nije bilo.
Nikad.
Živi ste i zdravi?
Živi i zdravi, nismo imali problema, ni najmanji problem nisam imala. Svi su mi dolazili, i vojnici, i narod drugi, nikad me nije niko vala, ni krivo pogledao, Boga mi.
What? Serbs not behaving like genocidal maniacs?
Komšije nam evo došle, evo 2 dana, uvijek imam nekoga od komšija, prate nas, plaćemo svi. Tako.
Rastajete se kao ljudi.
Rastajemo se kao ljudi.
Human beings? Them?
I volio da se sredi ovo, da mi opet i dalje zajednički živimo kao što smo živjeli, da dođe jedno vrijeme, da bude Jugoslavija kao što je bila.
Human compassion was something that was completely normal to a young Serbian man from Trebinje in Herzegovina called Srđan Aleksić. Srđan's father recalled how his son noticed that the Serb police was arresting a man on an ethnic basis.
Srđan je vidio da policajci vode Alena, pošao je za njima da vidi šta je razlog što ga vode. Dogodilo se da su naišli na pijanog vojnika koji je oteo Alena iz ruku policajaca kada je shvatio da je ovaj musliman. Ovaj vojnik je izvadio nož da zakolje Alena na ulici kao na najgrublji način što se može oduzeti čovjeku život. Srđan se umiješao, pohrvao se s vojnikom, Alen se skočio, pobjegao, Srđan je izbio nož vojniku iz ruka i pošao da ide, ali su naišla još trojica vojnika koja su izdaleka vidjeli da Srđan hrve sa vojnikom, napali su Srđana, oborili ga, gazili ga nogama, udarali. Srđan je ostao na ulici unesvješćen, vojnici su otišli kao obavili su svoj posao i živjeli se na čovjekom. Srđan je prevezen u bolnicu, konstatovan izliv krvi na mozak. 7 dana se Srđan borio za opstanak, za život. 7. dan, na sami dan, 27. januara 1993. godine, je Srđan umro.
This is one among many stories of true heroism that never made it to the Western media. The West was more focused on escalating the conflict so they could have the excuse for jumping in for their own interests. As the world celebrated peace in Bosnia, the international financial institutions were busily collecting former Yugoslavia's external debt from its remnant states, while transforming the Balkans into a safe haven for free enterprise. In late 1995, the West unveiled a reconstruction program that stripped Bosnia of sovereignty to a degree not seen in Europe since the end of World War II. It was pure colonialism, consisted largely of making Bosnia a divided territory under NATO military occupation and foreign administration. This pattern of intervention was so successful that the West just had to replicate it in Kosovo.
But I think that the region is very important in geostrategic terms, and they saw Kosovo as a very potential country to actually secure their presence in the region.
But the West underestimated the importance that Kosovo has to the Serbian people.
My fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo.
On March 24, 1999, on the order of Javier Solana, in an act of pure aggression, NATO had violated international law and the UN Charter by launching an air assault on Yugoslavia. The people of Yugoslavia, however, decided to show their true spirit by going outside, singing songs and having fun on their bridges in spite of the catastrophe around them.